Thank you for joining me today. My name is Father Mark, and I would like to share with you some thoughts that I have about reading the Bible. The Bible is divided into sections: the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament was written thousands of years ago. The New Testament is a testimony of Jesus as the Son of Man, the Son of God, who came into this world to bring salvation to humanity. He brought his new perspective to the Old Testament. For that reason, I tell people, let's not read from the Old Testament yet. Let's begin with the New Testament, which is at the end, towards the end of the Bible. And let's begin by reading 4 different perspectives of who Jesus was. The perspective of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and St. John, the evangelist. The first 3 evangelists, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we call them synoptics. And synoptics is a word that means if you put St. Mark's, St. Matthew's, and St. Luke's writings together, side by side, you'll be able to see the same stories, more or less in the same chronology. The same way that it was written in Mark will appear in Matthew and also in Luke. So synoptic, because when you put them together, we can follow more or less the same stories and understand from a different points of view. St. John, on the other hand, has different mentality. And when he writes, he wanted to write about something in a different way. And also he did not want to rewrite everything that was written before. That's the reason we will not find the same stories in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. We will not find them in St. John. Also, the stories that St. John brings will not be present in the other 3 Gospels. Now, there's more than 4 Gospels. There are about 40 Gospels that were discovered, but only 4 of them will be included in the Bible. The others that are not included in the Bible are called Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha are Gospels that we believe were written a lot later and that the first community of Christians were not aware of them. So there are Gospels according to the Virgin Mary. There is Gospel according to Mary Magdalene. There are Gospels about of Philip, Gospel of St. Thomas, Gospel of St. Peter, many other Gospels. There's a lot of them. But all these Gospels, when we study them, we realize that they come more like 200 years after Jesus was born. In fact, the first Gospel, St. Mark's, the one that was accepted in the Bible, canonical Bible, will be written 35 years after Jesus' death. 35 years. St. John, on the other hand, was written about 65 years after Jesus' death. Many people ask, why so late? Well, the mentality of the apostles and the disciples was that Jesus was going to come back right away. So if Jesus was going to come back right away, why are we going to write them? Their perspective was that the end of the world was now. And Jesus was considered an apocalyptic prophet. Apocalyptic prophet meant that in the time of Jesus and even before that, there were prophets and people that were totally sure that the end of the world was right now. That has not changed at all. So in the time of Jesus, even Jesus himself thought this is the end of the world. And he will say very clearly, not even the Son of God knows when the end of the world will come. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the end of the world in another video. The Gospels of Jesus have different characteristics based on the writers. So if St. Mark introduces Jesus, in the mentality of St. Mark's, Jesus is the Messiah who is not understood and will not be understood by people. In fact, throughout the first several chapters of St. Mark's, not even the disciples will understand Jesus. Jesus will turn towards them and say, "You do not understand? You're asking me?" It's as if Jesus becomes very frustrated because people are not listening. They're not reading the signs, and they do not understand that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. Matthew, on the other hand, when he writes, he's going to try to convince people that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. So Jesus is born out of a Messiah tradition. He's a descendant of David, and he fulfills every single one of the prophecies of the old time. The emphasis is different. While Mark wants to show that Jesus is the suffering Messiah, the misunderstood, Matthew wants to show that Jesus is in fact Jewish, that he fulfills the Jewish laws, and that he fulfills the prophecies. And on top of that, he came to change the misunderstanding of the rabbis and the church of their times. Luke has a different agenda. Luke sees Jesus from a universal point of view. So when Jesus is born, he brings the image of the Virgin Mary and the Magi coming from different parts of the world, because the whole world will be united in Jesus. And Jesus is the salvation for all, not only for the Jews, but salvation for all. We have to notice also that Luke is the one that writes the Acts of the Apostles. And St. Luke's and the Acts of the Apostles go very much together. The Acts of the Apostles wants to show that the mission of Jesus is for universality. Jesus was meant to create this amazing new perspective of religion, to create this new religion, if you wish, to create this new contact with God.